Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Mike Millian. I'm the president of the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. Normally, I have everybody forced unmuted and cameras, so you're not allowed to turn them on. I'm going to leave the ability there for everyone today to turn your cameras on and unmute yourself. However, I'm going to ask that you wait until Andre has done his presentation. Andre will be done around 11:45, 10 to 12 Eastern time, and then we'll have a roughly 10-minute question and answer period where you can either put that in the chat if you wish, or you can unmute yourself, turn your camera on, and you can ask Andre one-on-one. We have a smaller crowd today. We did have 27 register for the presentation. We have 9 online right now. Everybody who registered will get a copy of this presentation. So when it's done, you will get a recording of this and you will also get a PDF of Andre's presentation. So again, thanks for taking time out of your day for what I think is an important topic and one that I don't believe a lot of people are aware of yet. And it's September. Next year is going to come up pretty quickly. And there's a lot of work to do with this regulation, as you'll find out as Andre gets into it. I want to thank our sponsor of today's presentation, which is 10 Street. Their sponsorship made this presentation available to you for free. And I have a brief message here that I'm going to play from 10 Street. So I'm going to stop my video, mute myself, and we'll be back in a second.
We love 10th Street and all that it brought, and every year it just gets better. When my recruiters talk to folks on the phone, 9 times out of 10 they ask, do you have 10th Street?
10th Street has been really great.
It's really impressive to see how far-reaching 10th Street is. It's quickly becoming the language that all carriers are starting to speak, and more importantly, it's the language that most drivers are speaking.
I've used 10th Street my entire time in trucking, so that's 12-ish years. It's so user-friendly. You can get all the information you need in one space.
To have everything in one platform, we're not scrambling to reach for different data from different sources.
It's the one-stop shop. We are able to do everything from the initial calling to processing the email, to doing all the onboarding, to do all the stuff the safety department wants to do. Then HR with the company drives, the information is right there.
It has moved beyond just a strict applicant tracking system. It lets us almost operate like a CMS, a customer management solution, where we can really identify things about individual drivers in tags and notes and use that going forward.
There's so much in the reporting fields.
I've loved the reporting. I've been able to really take some good data from it. We've pivoted on some marketing strategies, and I've been able to hold the recruiters more accountable as well.
We are fully electronic with our personnel files now. Everything's on 10th Street, all of our forms. We do all of our onboarding online, and our drivers have their paperwork filled out before they come to class.
There's things that y'all got going now is the Driver Pulse app. We are seeing more drivers using that, which is a good thing. They can follow the application flow, keep up with things that need to be done. It's making the whole process go faster.
10th Street speeds up the process for us, makes it easier to get to the end game with the driver.
We get folks processed 10 times faster, from app to hire. So it's pretty awesome.
Stop wasting your time looking at other companies. 10th Street is there.
You won't go wrong. There's not a better product. Just go for it.
Excuse me. And once again, thanks to 10 Street for their sponsorship. Just before we get into the presentation, I just want to make everybody aware the PMTC's annual conference is coming up June 21st to 23rd in Hamilton, Ontario. You will get a copy of this presentation. As I said, the link that's embedded in this slide will take you to our webpage with all the information on our conference. It's 11 educational seminars over 2 days, plus a cocktail reception on the Wednesday. We have over 220 people registered so far, with about a month left to go. We are trending towards, and we expect to sell out of 325 people. We have 50 exhibitors that will be in our exhibitor showcase. I think the best event of the private fleet calendar by far. I might be a little biased, but it's a good event, and it's very affordable. $565 for a member, $640 for a non. If you're interested, click on the link, look it up, and we'd be glad to have you out at our conference in a month and introduce you to the private fleet industry if you're not aware of our association and our members. So without any further delay, I'm going to get into the reason that you're here today. So Andre Nowakowski is a labor and employment lawyer and is one of Miller Thompson's leading sports and entertainment lawyers. He represents and advises management in unionized and non-unionized workplaces in all areas of labor relations and employment law. Andre provides employers with practical, strategic, and proactive advice. Andre advises and represents private and broader public sector employees on a wide range of matters, including union organizing drivers and certification applications, unfair labor practice complaints, collective bargaining, grievance matters, labor arbitrations, human rights, employment standards, workplace policies, and workplace safety and insurance. Andre has presented lectures and seminars on all these topics and many more. He acts as a counsel to the National Hockey League clubs in salary arbitration disputes with their players. Outside of work, Andre has enjoyed coaching minor sports teams, staying active, and participating in charitable events. Andre, welcome. You want to turn your camera on and unmute yourself? I'm going to stop my screen share here, and I'll hand the controls over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. Let me just get the share screen going for the presentation here. Okay.
Perfect.
So
it's
up and running. Perfect. Thanks for the confirmation. Well, Mike, thanks very much for having me here today to speak on the federal pay equity. Yes, we're talking about what's coming, but in some ways it's already here because the legislation has been enforced for almost 2 years, but we're approaching the key deadline, which is about getting a pay equity plan in place. And as Mike mentioned, it is an important topic, and it's not something you want to fall behind on if the Pay Equity Act applies to your organization. It has been around for a while in Ontario, and there are unfortunately many instances where employers have fallen behind on their pay equity obligation, and it's just a big accruing liability. It's something that's not fun to tackle, but it is something necessary to tackle because of the legislation and the ramifications for employers that are covered by the legislation. So in terms of what we'll do today, we'll go through principles and application of the Act. We'll look at employers' obligations, and then we'll look at the duties and powers of the Pay Equity Commissioner, just so you have a sense of that. So turning to the first area, the principles and application. First basic question, what is pay equity? And important to understand that it's equal pay for work of equal value. So it's not making sure that people doing the exact same job are paid the same rate. It's about looking at jobs that appear different but may have equal value and making sure that they're compensated the same regardless of the gender of who occupies that position. And we'll come back and talk about gender more and the pay equity process. So this legislation was passed several years ago now, and as you see up there on the slide, it actually came into force at the end of August in 2021. And the real key date here for you is early September of 2024, when employers who are covered by the Act have to publish their pay equity plans and notify employees of any pay increases. And that may seem a long way away, but depending on the organization, that it can take quite a while to work through a pay equity process. And even in a smaller organization, it's still complicated. So you want to make sure that you have enough lead time to be able to get this into place and comply with the legislation. In terms of the purpose of the Pay Equity Act, what you see on the screen right now is exactly what's in the Pay Equity Act. You'll see that I've highlighted, underlined some key wording there, and it's about achieving pay equity. So that's the exercise in the pay equity plan, is getting to a point where an employer can say we've achieved pay equity, and that's done by addressing any gender-based discrimination in the pay values that are in an organization. And again, this isn't necessarily about intent. This is what has happened over time in an organization. And it's about that equal compensation for work of equal value that I was just speaking about. And then once you've achieved pay equity and got to that point, there's then an obligation to maintain pay equity on a going forward basis. So it's not something where you can just sit and achieve it and think there's nothing to do after that. And we'll come back to that. So who does the Act apply to? There are, of course, a number of public sector employers to whom it applies. And then on the private sector, it's employers who have 10 or more employees who are federally regulated. And for us, the important one, of course, is road transportation. And then there are a number of other areas that are covered by the legislation as well for federally regulated employers. So if you have 10 or more employees, this Act applies to you if you're federally regulated. In terms of assessing the bottom of the threshold, that 10 employee count, you have to look at the average number of employees who are working in any given year. Employees is pretty broad, and it covers management, people who might be in a bargaining unit if you're unionized, etc. And significantly, especially for this industry, it includes specifically dependent contractors. And I know that many trucking companies have employees, but also have dependent contractors who are doing driving, and they are captured by this legislation. So let's turn to your obligations as an employer under the legislation. And here's a summary of the key obligations. There has to be a pay equity committee. I'll get into that because not all employers need to have that. So we'll get into the distinction there. You definitely need to have a pay equity plan. And there's going to be the compensation that flows from that. There's an obligation to file annual statements, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail, and then updates to the pay equity plan after it's been created, which is that maintenance piece that I discussed, and we'll come back to again. So who has to establish a pay equity? Any employer with 100 or more employees has to have a pay equity committee. And then any employer who has 10 to 99 employees, and some of them are unionized. Of course, if all of them are unionized, that applies as well. But as long as you have some employees and are in that 10 to 99 threshold, you as an employer are going to need a pay equity committee to go through the process. So if you're an employer with less than 100 employees, but more than the 10, and all of them are non-union employees, then you do not have to establish a pay equity, although you may voluntarily decide to establish a pay equity committee. And in that case, there's a process that involves notifying the pay equity commissioner to go about creating a pay equity committee in a circumstance where you're not required to have one. And if you don't have a pay equity committee, the employer still has to create the pay equity plan. It just means that you do it alone as the employer without that committee involvement. So in terms of your requirement to have a pay equity committee, a notice has to be posted within 60 days of becoming subject to the act, which again is going back to the end of August of 21. So hopefully you've done that. And then that notice has to stay posted in the workplace until the pay equity plan is published. In terms of the pay equity committee and who is on it, there has to be at least 3 members. There has to be 1 representative of the employer, and 2/3 have to be employee representatives. At least 50% of the members have to be women. And then if some employees are unionized, there has to be at least 1 member who's from the bargaining unit representing the bargaining unit. If you have multiple bargaining units, then you're going to need representatives for each of the bargaining units in the workplace. And then if some employees are non-unionized, then there's going to have to be a representative from the non-union group of the non-union employees, and that person is selected by a majority of votes by those non-union employees. So once you've established a pay equity committee, it's going to need a few things from the employer. One is the time to do the work, space, equipment to do the work, the necessary information. So that's going to be information about salaries, etc., job descriptions, and confidentiality, because the employer will find out some things in the course of the discussions, and it has to keep those discussions with the pay equity committee confidential. And similarly, the pay equity committee has to keep things confidential through the process. So the pay equity plan, what an employer is required to do is develop and implement the pay equity plan that identifies and addresses any gender-based compensation gaps that are in the workplace. And then following that process is maintaining pay equity, again, through a process once that pay equity plan has been established. So the steps to develop the pay equity plan are set out here. Now, these are pretty broad strokes. I'm not going to get too much into detail here. You'll ultimately have to do that once you start going through the process. And I find that some employers will do this on their own, but often they'll retain a pay equity consultant who helps go through this because it can be complicated. First step is creating job classes. And basically, it can be a 1 position job class, or there can be multiple positions in a job class, but you can only group multiple positions together if they have similar duties, similar responsibilities, and are within a similar salary range as well. And as I said, that's going to require some analysis, right? It's a complex process. So that's looking at what jobs you have in the organization and figuring out how they get all grouped together. The second step is then looking at the job classes and determining which ones are predominantly female and which ones are predominantly male. And how you determine that is by looking at whether there are 60% or more females in the position, or if it has 60% or more males in the position. And that tells you whether it's a female job class or a male job class. If it doesn't meet the threshold in either, then it's a gender neutral job class, which doesn't come into consideration as you go through the pay equity process. In terms of figuring out, well, is this a female job class or a male job class? You look to what is the current situation. You may have to also look at the historical perspective for that position. In terms of the third step, That's then getting into the job evaluation, where you evaluate and create a value, assign a value of the work done in these job classes, the female and the male job classes. And you do this through a gender neutral job evaluation. And what you use is generally a gender neutral job evaluation tool that allows to go through a process where you evaluate the jobs based on stipulated criteria, which I've set out there for you in step 3, skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And those get measured in various areas, and there's many breakdowns of how you look at it and look at the components of the job. This is, again, really high level. It's a complex process, but that's the task at hand then, is creating and figuring out the value of these job classes so that you can then compare. In step 4, you look at the total compensation, and ultimately you have to look at it on a dollars per hour basis for the male job classes and the female job classes. And then that allows you to create that comparison. Once you know that one job is being paid $20.31 an hour and the other is being paid $27.14 an hour. And then that gets us to step 5, where the compensation of the male and female job classes is compared to determine whether there are differences in compensation between those job classes, which will then allow you to determine whether there's pay owing to the female job classes in comparison to the male job classes. The Act stipulates 2 methods for comparing compensation. One's called the equal average method, and one's the equal line method, and that's really creating a regression line. There's a possibility to have another approved method, but it has to be approved by the Pay Equity Commissioner. But you have these 2 methods that are prescribed, and for example, the equal line, the regression line, that's something that's used under the Ontario Pay Equity regime, and this is where you require a close look and an understanding of how to apply these calculation tools for comparison. So the process, what the goal is consensus about what's involved in the job. Does everybody on the committee agree on what constitutes the job description? Does everybody agree on how to score things in the different categories of skill, responsibility? In terms of the tool you have, there'll be a scoring system, so there might be dispute. Somebody says the skills required for a certain job rank at number 2. And somebody might believe, no, they rank a number 5. And so that's the type of dispute you can get into. So when you have that, and it could also be a dispute about should we be using the equal line or the equal average methodology or something else, then you look at how to try to resolve these discrepancies. And one is try to work collaboratively to try to get a consensus agreement. Sometimes it might be having a third-party expert provide a neutral perspective. And I mentioned pay equity consultants before, and that's who sometimes comes in as a facilitator of a process to help everybody work through it, and sometimes also to help mediate it. And that might be somebody other than a pay equity consultant. There certainly are in the labor world many arbitrators, especially in Ontario, who have dealt with pay equity matters. If you can't settle a matter in the Pay Equity Committee, then that could require the intervention then of the Pay Equity Commissioner. And the commissioner could try to have mediation and ultimately a settlement. There could be an investigation with an order that gets issued that tells the parties what to do in the circumstance. And that's a bit more of a formal process where the parties get to make arguments and present evidence. It can be referred to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and I'll just pause there to say that unlike in Ontario, where there's a pay equity commission and a pay equity hearings tribunal, the pay equity regime has been subsumed under the Canadian Human Rights Act and Tribunal. And then ultimately, of course, the issue can be dismissed as perhaps not being one that has merit or being outside of jurisdiction. So a draft of the pay equity plan has to be posted, and employees have to be given an opportunity to provide their written comments on the plan. And they have to be given 60 days to provide their comments. And this is an important step of the process. And this is regardless of whether you have a committee or not. And that allows people to identify what they see as issues, whether it be in how they think their job was evaluated and scored, or in how they think other jobs were evaluated or scored, or maybe they'll have a dispute about what has been called a female job class or a male job class. Ultimately, the pay equity plan has to be posted in the workplace once it's finalized. And there's various required content that has to be in the pay equity plan. It has to set out the job classes, the value of the job class, whether it's a male job class or a female job class, etc. So we've gone through the process and have a pay equity plan, and it will identify if there are any female job classes that are owed an increase in compensation. Again, that's after going through that comparison method, using that equal average process or the equal line method, or if there's a different method that's been approved for your organization by the Pay Equity Commissioner. And once it's determined that an increase is owed to any female job class, then the employer has an obligation to implement those changes. And in terms of posting, any notices of pay increases have to be posted in the workplace for at least 60 days. In terms of paying that increase, so it is payable once that final version of the pay equity plan is posted, or certainly at the date it should have been posted, which is early September next year. And even if you haven't done a pay equity plan by that point, the liability will start accruing. And here on this slide, you also see an approach to how to pay if it's over 1% of the prior year's total payroll. Then you're given an opportunity to phase in the increases. And for those of you who have Ontario pay equity experience, this is a little bit different because there's a time frame to the phase in. And we see that employers who have 100+ employees, they have 3 years to phase in the increases. And employers who have 10 to 99 employees are going to have 5 years to phase in the increases. So as you can guess, if you have a pay equity amount that exceeds 1% of the prior year's total payroll, that can be a pretty significant amount. And 3 years or 5 years to pay that all in a phased approach, even in the phased approach, is still possibly going to be pretty onerous depending on what the gaps are and how many employees are affected. So it's definitely worthwhile to get ahead of this as much as possible so that you can understand as an employer what are the potential liabilities here, so you can plan accordingly for it and account for those liabilities and how they might accrue. And when we talk about the accruing liability, there's also the aspect of interest, which starts accruing compounding. And that starts on the day on which the compensation is due. So again, that's going to be no later than early September of next year. You do have a bit of a window as an employer from complaints about not paying any increase. That window is for 90 days. But interest is still going to accrue during that time. But if payments haven't been made after that 90 days, that's when complaints and penalties can start. And what I'd also say there, just in terms of complaints, and I think it's going to be the same at the federal level as it is at the Ontario level. As an employer, if you can work these things out with the pay equity internally, looking at what employee issues are raised during that posting period of the draft plan, and better to resolve it if you can, and including if you have to work with a union in the workplace to work it through, because things get out of control somewhat once the commission gets involved. And if possible, it's nice to avoid that. Now, it may not be avoidable in all circumstances. You just may not be able to reach that consensus, and might just have to have a dispute, an investigation process, a litigation process involved. But if you can resolve them, then that's all for the better in terms of avoiding the cost and time involved. It's possible for the Pay Equity Commissioner to extend a deadline for an employer to submit the pay equity plan, but know that you may have to pay a lump sum to cover those adjustments during the period of extension. I mentioned annual statements a bit earlier, so that's something that's going to have to be submitted to the Pay Equity Commissioner, and that has to be submitted. The first one has to be submitted within 1 year of the first pay equity plan being posted. As you'll see on this slide, there's a fair amount of information that has to be included on the annual statement, including the number of employees that are employed, how many female job classes require compensation increases, total number of employees in each job class, etc. So it's something that there's going to be ongoing diligence that has to be performed as an employer in this process. Mentioned earlier the maintenance or updating the pay equity plan, and this has to be maintained. It's not enough just to achieve pay equity and create a pay equity plan. It then has to be maintained, and that pay equity plan has to be updated every 5 years. And if you have a pay equity committee, then that updating has to be done in conjunction with the pay equity committee. Of course, after 5 years, you may have personnel changing on that pay equity committee, but that obligation is still going to be there. So after the plan is updated in the maintenance phase, you may have to make retroactive payments that have arisen because things have changed over the 5 years since you last reviewed the pay equity plan or created the pay equity plan. And sometimes pay equity gaps emerge, so that's what the retroactive payments will be compensated for. So looking then at the duties and powers of the Pay Equity Commissioner. So the Pay Equity Commissioner, first of all, is a full-time member of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and with a specific responsibility for the Pay Equity Act and administering it and enforcing it. So the duties of the Pay Equity Commissioner include ensuring that federally regulated employers are making sure that pay equity exists, that the value of female job classes is the same as paid the same as the valuation of the male job classes. There's an education component and informing employers, employees, and bargaining agents, the trade unions, on their rights and obligations under the Act, and also to try to facilitate the resolution of disputes that arise regarding pay equity. An employer or a pay equity committee can ask the Pay Equity Commissioner to change certain rules under the Pay Equity Act that apply to them. I don't think that's going to be an easy process, but there's a mechanism for it. In terms of the discretion that the Pay Equity Commissioner has, we mentioned already possibly extending deadlines, using another method other than the equal average or equal line method for comparing compensation, possibly allowing the pay equity committee to have different membership requirements, and that would have to, of course, be something unique to the employer's workplace, where it may not be feasible, for example, to have the pay equity committee structured the way it's stipulated in the Act, possibly to allow a group of employers to be treated as a single employer. So the pay equity commissioner will, of course, be able to take action against employers if employers engage in certain items that are prohibited under the Act. The first bullet, and that's the most important one, is that you cannot reduce an employee's compensation to achieve pay equity. So if the difference between the relevant female job class and the relevant male job class is that the female job class is paid $4 an hour less than the male job class, you cannot reduce the male job class wage rate by any amount to try to achieve pay equity. It's the female job class that has to be raised entirely up to that male job class wage rate. So no reducing compensation either to female or male job classes can occur. Obstructing the pay equity commissioner will get an employer into trouble, making false or misleading statements, and taking a reprisal against an employee for participating in a proceeding under the Pay Equity Act. So not that different from what we see in other legislative regimes like workplace safety and insurance, for example. You can't get in the way of the investigator. You can't make false statements or misleading statements, and you can't take actions against an employee for basically asserting or complying with their rights under the legislation. Pay Equity Commissioner can conduct audits to see if there's compliance with the Pay Equity Act. Just to touch again on the Ontario experience, for a while this did not happen. About 10 years ago, it started happening again, not necessarily specifically for employers in the absence of a complaint, but sometimes targeting industries where they felt that they wanted to check in on what was happening in industry to make sure there was pay equity compliance amongst employers generally. So expect perhaps something like this will happen under this pay equity legislation at the federal level. A pay equity commissioner can order an employer to conduct an internal audit and report on those results to the commissioner. And the commissioner can, of course, conduct an investigation if it identifies issues that require some more in-depth review and examination. If you violate the act, that could be liable for paying a penalty under the regulation. In terms of appeal process, the parties can apply for a review of a commissioner's decision. And so the commissioner might decide to dismiss a complaint or discontinue an investigation, so that can be appealed, sort of like a reconsideration, if you will. Parties can also apply to the chair of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to appeal an order that's been issued by the Pay Equity Commissioner, which is not dissimilar to the Ontario experience, where the Pay Equity officer can issue an order, but that can be appealed up to the Pay Equity Hearings Tribunal. So similar in that respect. So that brings the presentation to a close. Again, that was a really high-level overview. The devil really is in the details, and that's one slide with the steps to creating the pay equity plan, creating the job classes, going through the job evaluation, comparing the compensation to female and male job classes. But hopefully this gives you enough of a sense of what you need to start looking at in your organization and take a path forward towards that deadline next year in the fall. Mike, I'll turn that over to you and any questions that anybody may have.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself, turn your camera on and fire away, or type it into the the chat. So does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask of Andre on the topic that he just presented? They might be letting you off easy here, Andre. I'm not seeing anything in the chat other than thank you, and I'm not seeing anybody unmute themselves and turn their cameras on. So but we might be letting you off the hook easy.
Oh, there you go. Well, I'd say that, of course, if you think of questions later, by all means, feel reaching out to Mike or me, and I'll try to answer as best as I can. And maybe I'll just comment. There's no case law really under this legislation at this point. It's too new. And so often any questions that you have in the process are going to be best practice answers, right? And to the extent that Ontario's had a pay equity system in place for decades, that's often where the approach will probably come from in trying to answer questions where there's ambiguity, uncertainty in the legislation, and how to go through the pay equity process, whether you're using a committee or doing it on your own as an employer.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's going to be a lot of challenges with it. That's for sure, and it's not going to be an easy process. But
no.
All right. Well, not seeing anything, so I guess we'll let you go. I want to thank everyone for taking the time today. Recording of this will be sent out in the next day or two, along with Andre, if possible. Am I allowed to send out your presentation?
Yes, I'll send you a PDF copy.
Perfect. And we'll send that out along with it. So thanks, Andre. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our sponsor, 10th Street, for making this possible. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
All right. I'm just going to stop the recording here if I can figure it out. All right. Take care, all.